In 1886, a mining engineer named John T. Reid was working a claim near the town of Lovelock, in the Humboldt Sink of western Nevada, when a group of Paiute men told him something he had not asked to hear. There was a cave nearby, they said, and it held the bones of a people who were not their people. Reid wrote the story down almost exactly as he heard it, because he had the habit of a man who kept notes on everything, including things he did not yet understand. The Paiute called this vanished people the Si-Te-Cah, the tule-eaters, and they said their own ancestors had cornered them inside that cave, sealed the mouth of it with brush, and burned them where they stood. Reid walked out to the site himself. He found a low, narrow opening in a limestone outcrop above the dry bed of what had once been Lake Lahontan, and inside it, only bat guano, tons of it, packed into the dark for what looked like centuries. He had no way yet to know that the floor beneath that guano held one of the most productive archaeological sites in North America, or that the legend he had just written down would outlive every mining claim in the county. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Paiute had not invented this story for Reid's benefit. A Paiute woman named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, daughter of Chief Winnemucca and granddaughter of a Paiute leader who had guided some of the first white travelers through the Great Basin, had already set the same account into print a few years earlier in her 1883 memoir, Life Among the Piutes, Their Wrongs and Claims. Winnemucca wrote the book after years spent as an interpreter, a lecturer, and an advocate trying to get the United States government to honor treaties it kept breaking, and the book itself became the first known copyrighted work published by a Native American woman. She was not writing for entertainment, and she was not writing for men like Reid, who would not read her book for years yet. She was writing to be believed on matters far more urgent to her than an old story about a vanished enemy. That the Si-Te-Cah legend appears in her book at all, tucked into a larger account of Paiute history and suffering, tells you it was not treated by her as folklore performed for outsiders. It was simply part of what her people knew about where they lived. Her version describes a race of people her ancestors called the Si-Te-Cah, red-haired, pale-skinned, and by her account so hostile that coexistence with them was never a real possibility. Her people endured raids and disappearances for years before enough of the surrounding bands finally united against them. The Si-Te-Cah retreated into a cave in the Sink country and refused every demand to come out and fight. So the allied bands piled brush and dried tule reed across the entrance and set it burning. The few who ran from the smoke were killed at the mouth of the cave. The rest stayed inside and did not come out again. What separates this from 1,000 other extinction stories told across the continent is that the site was never left to memory alone. It had a name, a location, a shape you could walk into. It sat in low limestone hills above a desert that had been the floor of a genuine inland sea within a time frame that geology, not myth, can date. Lake Lahontan once covered roughly 8,000 square miles of what is now western Nevada, fed by rivers draining out of the Sierra Nevada during the wetter climate of the last glacial period, and it began its long retreat only around 13,000 years ago, leaving behind the alkali flats, the dry sinks, and the isolated limestone caves that had once sat along its ancient shoreline. The people who told Reid the story were not describing a doorway to another world in some vague spiritual register. They were describing a hole in a specific hillside above a lake that used to be there, and they took him to it. For years after Reid's visit, nobody did anything with the cave except mine it. Guano is rich in nitrates, and nitrates were valuable to a fertilizer industry hungry for anything that could feed the fields of a rapidly growing country. A company under miners named James Hart and David Pugh moved in around 1911 and began pulling the material out by the ton, eventually shipping more than 250 tons of it to a processing company in San Francisco. Guano miners are not archaeologists, and they were aware, even at the time, that they were digging through more than droppings. Contemporary accounts describe them setting aside the occasional basket or bundle that caught their eye and discarding or destroying the rest, which means an unknown quantity of material and an unknown amount of the layered evidence archaeologists rely on to date a site was gone before anyone with training ever climbed down into that chamber. What stopped the mining was not curiosity, it was the debris itself, the refuse the ancient occupants had left behind. Centuries of matting, basketry fragments and bone had become so thick and so mixed into the usable guano that the fertilizer company could no longer process it profitably. The mining company contacted the University of California, and in the spring of 1912, the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber sent a field worker named Llewellyn L. Loud out to Nevada to recover whatever could still be salvaged. Loud spent 5 months in that cave, working through material the miners had already disturbed, and came away with something close to 10,000 catalogued specimens, woven baskets, cordage, matting, sandals measuring up to 15 inches long, and, threaded through the debris, mummified human remains, preserved by the same bone-dry air that had kept everything else intact. Funding ran out before Loud could return the following season, and then the First World War absorbed the attention and money that might otherwise have gone back into a Nevada bat cave. It was not until 1924 that Mark Harrington, working under the Museum of the American Indian, convinced his superiors to fund a second expedition, with Loud himself returning to lend his experience to the site he had already come to know better than anyone alive. Working in the deeper, older layers near the cave's original floor, Harrington's team found one of roughly 40 separate storage pits eventually uncovered at the site. Inside one of them was a bundle wrapped in rush matting that Harrington later described in his own field notes. 11 decoys shaped and painted to resemble canvas-back ducks, dyed red and black, most still carrying real feathers taken from birds hunted long before, along with a bag of loose feathers and 2 bundles of snares made from twisted string and twigs. All of it sealed in a stone-lined cache and left exactly as some hunter had packed it away against a season that never came for him to retrieve it. Radiocarbon testing done decades later dated the decoys to somewhere around 300 years before the Common Era, making them, at the time of their discovery, the oldest confirmed hunting decoys found anywhere in the world. Harrington also cut a formal stratigraphic section into the deepest part of the cave floor, dividing what he found into an older period, a transitional period, and a later period based on the styles of tool and technique that appeared and disappeared as the layers rose. He and Loud were able to show, for instance, that the atlatl, a hooked throwing stick used to launch a dart with far more force than an arm alone could manage, belonged strictly to the older period and had been replaced in later layers by the bow. Taken together, the stratigraphy pointed to something close to 4,000 years of near-continuous human habitation in that one cave, with the densest period of use falling between roughly 1,500 years before the Common Era and the middle of the first millennium after it. Archaeologists came to call the people responsible for that long occupation the Lovelock culture. The Paiute themselves, when later asked directly, called that earlier people the Si-Te-Cah. Here is where the story usually gets told badly, and where it deserves better than either extreme. Some of the mummified remains recovered from the cave did show hair with a distinctly reddish or auburn cast, and that single detail is what carried the story out of the anthropology journals and into the popular press. Newspapers in the early 20th century, and later a handful of roadside attractions that displayed Lovelock material to paying visitors, ran with the idea that Reid and Winnemucca's account had been physically confirmed, and pushed the claim well past anything the excavation notes said. Skeletons reported at 8, 9, even 10 feet tall began circulating in print, feeding a story that had far more appeal as a tourist draw than as a documented finding. None of that part holds up. Loud and Harrington's own field notes, and the physical remains themselves, describe ordinary human stature throughout. No skeleton recovered from Lovelock Cave has ever measured meaningfully outside the normal range for people of that era and region. Whatever the Si-Te-Cah were, they were not physically enormous, at least not by anything the bones in that cave have shown. The hair is a separate question, and it resolves less cleanly. A folklorist named Adrienne Mayer, who examined the legend at length for her research into indigenous American oral traditions, noted that human hair pigment is chemically unstable after death, and that dark hair buried for centuries in mineral-rich, oxidizing soil can shift toward red or auburn as the original pigment breaks down, a documented process that has misled more than one excavation into overstating the natural hair color of ancient remains. That caution deserves to be taken seriously. It does not fully settle the matter either, because the Paiute account did not need soil chemistry to describe their adversaries as red-haired. Winnemucca wrote it plainly in 1883, decades before anyone had exhumed a body with hair for chemistry to discolor. Whether that detail in the oral tradition reflects a genuine memory of an unusual population, an embellishment picked up somewhere across generations of retelling, or a pure coincidence with what post-mortem soil chemistry later produced in that cave floor, is a question nobody has definitively answered. It sits exactly where Mayer left it, unresolved, and it deserves to stay that way rather than get forced into either a tidy confirmation or a tidy debunking. What is not in dispute is the cave itself, and what continued to come out of it as excavation methods improved. The cave sits roughly 150 feet deep and 35 feet wide, with two entrances cut into a limestone outcrop that once stood along the shoreline of Lake Lahontan, and later radiocarbon work on organic material recovered from its floor confirmed occupation stretching back nearly 4,000 years, long before the Paiute themselves arrived in the region, which most estimates place at only 600 to 1,000 years ago. That gap matters. It means the Paiute, when they moved into the Humboldt Sink, were not settling an empty desert. They were moving into a landscape that had already been worked, lived in, and buried in by a people who came before them by a margin of thousands of years. The basketry, the sandals, the decoys carved and dyed with enough precision to fool a live canvasback from across open water, all of it points to a settled, technically capable culture that had generations to refine its craft along that one narrow strip of shoreline before the lake it depended on finally receded into the alkali flat that surrounds the cave today. Whether that earlier Lovelock culture is the same population the Paiute remembered as the Si-Te-Cah is the part of the puzzle no catalogue of artifacts can settle. The archaeological record shows continuous habitation and gradual cultural change over thousands of years, the kind of slow transition you would expect from one group evolving or being displaced by another through ordinary contact and pressure rather than a single dramatic extermination. The oral record shows something else entirely, a specific, violent, remembered event fixed to one cave with a beginning, a siege, and an end. Both things can be true without contradicting each other. A long, gradual population shift across the centuries could still have ended, at one particular and narrow moment in time, in exactly the kind of violent final confrontation that oral tradition is built to preserve and archaeology is poorly equipped to detect, because a single battle inside one cave leaves a far smaller footprint in the ground than 4,000 years of ordinary daily habitation does. There is another detail in Reid's original account and in later retellings collected from other Paiute elders around the Humboldt Sink that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The legend, as recorded, does not describe a single sealed chamber. It describes a network, tunnels running beneath the low hills around the sink, with the cave mouth Reid found serving as only one entrance into a larger system the Si-Te-Cah were said to move through when they raided nearby camps and vanished before anyone could follow. The formal excavations at Lovelock Cave never mapped any such branching system, and no survey has ever confirmed passages extending meaningfully beyond the two entrances and the single chamber that Loud and Harrington cleared. That absence could simply mean the tunnels never existed outside the story. It could also mean that decades of guano mining, followed by two separate excavations focused entirely on the material inside that one chamber, never had a reason to probe for lateral passages using tools that did not exist in 1912 or 1924. Nobody in that era was looking for tunnels. They were looking for artifacts, and they found so many that the search never had cause to turn sideways into the rock. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. John T. Reid himself never got to see any of what came after his 1886 visit. He tried, in his own limited way, to interest the Nevada Historical Society in the site. Once word of the Guano operation reached him years later, and by most accounts, he took some satisfaction in having been the one to first put the story into a written record that outsiders could act on. But he was a mining engineer working a claim in a hard, unforgiving stretch of desert, not an archaeologist, and the resources to properly excavate a cave were not his to command. What he left behind was smaller than a discovery and larger than a rumor. A location, a date, and a name, Si-Te-Cah, spelled the way he heard it from men whose language he did not speak fluently, filtered through whatever translation was available to him in a mining camp in the 1880s. That the name he wrote down matches, almost exactly, the name Winnemucca had already published 3 years earlier in a book from a Boston press that Reid, by his own account, had never read, is one of the quieter pieces of evidence in this entire story. Two people, with no contact with each other, working from two different sources inside the same scattered Paiute communities, wrote down the same name for the same vanished enemy within a few years of each other. That kind of convergence does not prove the underlying story is literally true. It does make it considerably harder to dismiss as something invented for either of their benefit. The name itself carries its own piece of evidence, easy to miss unless you know the language it comes from. Si-Te-Cah in northern Paiute is generally translated as tule-eaters, a reference to the reed that grew thick along the shoreline of Lake Lahontan and its shrinking remnants for as long as anyone can trace. Tule was not a minor plant to the people of the Great Basin. It was shelter, woven into mats and used to roof and wall temporary structures. It was food, its roots and pollen both edible. It was transportation, bundled and lashed into rafts buoyant enough to cross open water, which is precisely the detail that appears in some of the more elaborate retellings of the Si-Te-Cah legend collected from Paiute elders in the 20th century, describing the vanished people as having arrived from somewhere else entirely by crossing open water on rafts built from that same reed. Whether that detail belongs to the oldest core of the tradition or was folded in later, it fits an odd recurring shape found in flood and remnant people legends across an improbably wide stretch of the Americas. A Spanish chronicler named Pedro Cieza de Leon, traveling through Peru in the 1540s, recorded an entirely separate Andean account of giants who arrived by raft along the coast and were eventually destroyed by the people already living there, a story with no plausible route of contact back to the Great Basin and no shared language with the Paiute to explain the resemblance. Nobody has offered a satisfying account of why the same basic shape, an outside people, a body of water, a violent end, recurs in unconnected oral traditions on two different continents. It may be coincidence built from how any culture imagines an enemy. It may be something older and more widely shared than either tradition alone can explain. Neither possibility resolves the other. The excavation itself, meanwhile, sat inside a larger, less romantic story about how American archaeology was becoming a real discipline in exactly this period. Alfred Kroeber, the anthropologist who dispatched Loud to Nevada in 1912, was one of the people building the field's professional standards almost from scratch, insisting on stratigraphy, careful cataloging, and provenance at a time when most digging in the American West was still done by curiosity seekers and profit-driven outfits with no interest in where, exactly, inside a cave floor, an object had come from. Lovelock Cave sits at an odd hinge point in that transition. The Guano miners who found the first artifacts represent the old, careless way material left the ground. Loud and Harrington, arriving after the damage was already done, represent the new way, methodical, stratified, obsessive about layers and dates, but working on a site that had already lost an unknown fraction of its evidence before they ever set foot in it. Every question this story cannot answer, about tunnels, about the fire, about exactly how the Lovelock culture relates to the Si-Te-Cah of Paiute memory, is a question that a full, undisturbed excavation might have had a far better chance of answering, and that chance went into a fertilizer ship bound for San Francisco in 1911, one shovelful of nitrate-rich cave floor at a time. The institutional handling of Lovelock Cave after the major excavations is its own quiet story, separate from the legend but tangled up with it all the same. The bulk of what Loud and Harrington recovered went east, into the collections of the University of California and the Museum of the American Indian, the two institutions that had funded the digs. Some material stayed closer to home, held by the Nevada Historical Society and later by the State Museum system. For decades, the human remains in particular sat in institutional storage, the way thousands of Native American remains sat in institutional storage all across the country during that period, catalogued as specimens rather than returned as ancestors. It was not until the passage of federal repatriation law near the close of the 20th century that tribes gained a formal legal pathway to request the return of remains and burial goods taken from sites like Lovelock Cave, and the process of identifying, documenting, and returning that material to Paiute descendant communities has continued in stages ever since, slowly and not without friction between the institutions holding the collections and the tribes asking for them back. The cave itself was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1984, its precise location listed as address restricted, a formal acknowledgement that whatever remains inside it now belongs to a public record rather than a private claim, even as its exact coordinates are kept out of easy reach. Present-day members of the Paiute community have not treated the Si-Te-Cah story as a settled piece of folklore to be handed to outside researchers and forgotten. Tribal historians consulted during the repatriation process in recent decades have generally been careful to separate the sensational, giant-obsessed version that circulated in newspapers and roadside museums from the version their own families actually passed down, which tends to be shorter, less concerned with height or hair color, and more focused on the fact that a real conflict happened, in a real place, and ended in a way severe enough to be worth remembering for generations. That distinction matters because it means the version of the legend that reached the widest audience, the one built around 10-foot skeletons and a lost race of giants, was shaped far more by the exhibit halls and newspaper columns of the early 20th century than by anything the Paiute themselves originally emphasized. The core claim that an earlier people lived in that stretch of desert, came into violent conflict with Paiute ancestors, and were destroyed in a specific cave, appears to be the older and steadier part of the account. The giants were added later, by people with a financial interest in a better story. That leaves the present-day site itself carrying two separate kinds of weight. To the archaeological record, it is NVC-CHE 18, a National Register listing, a stratified sequence running from the older period through the transitional period into the later one, a source of the oldest confirmed duck decoys ever found, and one of the largest basketry assemblages recovered anywhere in the Great Basin. To the Paiute communities whose ancestors either fought at that cave mouth or were driven into it, depending on which side of the story you are willing to entertain, it is a place tied to a specific act of violence old enough that no living person can testify to it directly, but specific enough that it was worth writing down twice, independently, before either writer had any professional or financial reason to embellish it. Both of those things are true about the same low limestone hill above the same dead lake, and neither cancels the other out. None of that resolves the older question, the one Reid heard in 1886, and Winnemucca had already written down before him. Who exactly were the Si-Te-Cah, and what happened inside that cave? The most conservative reading available is also the most likely one, that the Lovelock culture, the long-settled population whose baskets and decoys and mummified dead filled that chamber for thousands of years, came into violent conflict with the ancestors of the Paiute at some point during the slow population turnover the stratigraphy shows, and that a specific and terrible episode from that longer conflict, a siege, a fire, a cave sealed against people trying to escape it, survived in Paiute memory as a single fixed event long after the larger, slower story around it faded into the background. Under that reading, the Si-Te-Cah were not giants and probably were not a wholly separate race in the sense the word now implies. They were the people who came before, remembered afterward, through the lens of the last and worst thing that happened between them and the people who replaced them. The harder, more honest position is that we do not actually know, and that the gap between what the oral tradition insists happened and what the excavated ground can confirm is exactly the space this story has always lived in. The Paiute did not describe a cave fire as metaphor. They described it as something that happened, in a place they could point to people they distinguished clearly from themselves. The archaeology confirms the place was inhabited for millennia, confirms it held a technically accomplished culture, confirms remains were recovered whose hair color genuinely puzzled the people who dug them up, and confirms no evidence whatsoever of anyone unusually large. It does not confirm a siege, a fire, or an extermination, because a single violent event, however real, does not always leave marks that a partial excavation focused on artifact recovery is built to find. Calling the legend disproven because the giants were never there mistakes one exaggerated detail for the whole account. Calling it literal history because some hair came out auburn makes the same mistake in the other direction. What is left standing after both errors are set aside is narrower and stranger, a people with a specific, geographically anchored memory of displacing or destroying an earlier population, told consistently enough across multiple tellings and multiple decades that it reached print twice, independently, from two different sources, years apart, before either author had reason to know what the other had written. Lovelock Cave is still there, above the dry bed of the vanished lake, its coordinates held at arm's length by the same federal listing that protects it. The bulk of what came out of it now sits catalogued in collections far from the desert that produced it, some artifacts on display, most in storage, the human remains slowly working their way back toward the descendant communities with a legal claim to them. The site is no longer actively excavated. What tunnels, if any, run beneath the surrounding hills beyond the two entrances and the single-chamber three separate waves of miners and archaeologists already cleared has never been formally surveyed, because nobody excavating for guano or artifacts across those 12 years had a reason to go looking sideways into the rock instead of down through the floor they were already standing on. The Paiute told John T. Reid where their ancestors' enemies had gone to ground and did not come out. He found the cave exactly where they said it would be. Anyone standing at either of its two entrances today is standing at the same fixed point Reid stood at, on the same dry lake bed, looking into the same limestone opening that has now been written about, dug through, guarded by federal listing, and still never fully explained. What the fire actually consumed inside it, and whether anything of that older, displaced people still runs unmapped beneath the hills around it, remains precisely where the record left it in 1886, recorded, located, partially confirmed, and never fully closed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.